we get this story of the guy who's looking for his keys under the lamp. And someone comes up and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking for my keys." He says, "Is this where you dropped them?" He says, "No, I dropped them in the forest over there." "Why are you looking under the lamp?" "Because this is where I can see," he says.
I'm here today with Nora Bateson. Nora, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Normally, I start these conversations by asking folks to introduce themselves or sort of give a sense of their background related to, the topic we're talking about. But thinking about your work and thinking about combining in particular, you metaphorize yourself as a meadow. So I thought maybe the right way to kick off the conversation is, how is your meadow today?
Ah, thank you for that. Um, Introductions are they always have a danger of reductionism in them. I could give you my CV, but I am not my CV. So I love this. How is your meadow today? My meadow is, it's in need of a little light rain shower. But it's doing well. Thank you for asking. How is your meadow?
My meadow is good. My meadow is good. I think um, mine is excited for the sunlight of this conversation.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Well, let's start. I want to kind of toggle between some of the like broad macro systems issues that you discuss, and of course the very intimate individual ways of relating that you discuss. And obviously, I'm sort of like forcing that separation because as you artfully demonstrate, there really is no difference between those things. But in terms of making some of your ideas legible in a linear conversation form, maybe let's start with something really broad. So, what is the importance of systems thinking, ecological thinking, thinking relationally, and how does that stand sort of in contradistinction to our means of sense making in modernity?
Fair enough. Well, the means of sense making in modernity that started quite a while ago, probably back in the 1600s or before, but definitely in through the industrial age, found efficiency and optimization and productivity in a mechanistic metaphor. And that mechanistic metaphor requires categories and delineated separatedness. Um, so it's a lot has come out of that, and it's also been destructive in many ways, including colonialism and the destruction that has happened to indigenous peoples all over the world, and uh, the natural world. There's the idea that you can cut something up to understand it and make it more efficient, um, is an idea that's prevalent in our school systems, in the economic system, political system, health system. So it's and certainly technology only serves to make it go faster. So the practice of what is sometimes called systemic thinking or ecological thinking is a practice of perceiving the contexts and the many things that are already deeply intertwined and entangled, that produce whatever situation you're dealing with, whether it's something at home or something globally. It's not a standalone. So the ease or the the accessibility, I think is the word I'm looking for, to that type of familiar thinking of mechanistic work is a real danger because it obscures the other work of going deeper into the perception of the context itself. And it's really just all too easy to say, well, in this family, the child is the problem, or the mom is the problem, or and to isolate that that person. And the same thing might happen when you say we need to fix the school system, and the school system gets isolated. But the school system is not isolated. The mom is not isolated. The child is not isolated. And whatever distortions and configurations of difficulty are going on are not in those isolated nodes. They're in a multitude of relational processes. And so this type of thinking produces a sense of agency and action toward then generating a solution to the problem in its isolated form. And what that does is actually generate a lot of consequences back in the ecology of the situation, or the systemics of the situation. And so it's always a trick, because people will say, oh well, but we don't have time to take all this into account, and the interconnectedness, where's the edge of it, and you can't fit it all on the spreadsheet. We just have to get things done. And while I would agree that we just have to get things done and that there isn't a lot of time, there's also not a lot of time to unravel more disasters. So somehow there's this math in the world that says that there is time to deal with all the terrible consequences on that side, but on the before side, before taking an action, somehow there's not time to take into consideration the processes that are entangled in it. So this for me is, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've found myself saying those words in various situation rooms, and the the addiction to
Mm,
efficiency is actually so pernicious, because the product has to get developed, the thing's got to go online, there's only this much money for what we have to do, and then we have to leave,
mm,
and then what happens, and
mm,
it's not my department. And that thinking, it causes a lot of problems, but even bigger than that, it doesn't ask us to practice contextual interaction,
mm, mm,
which is a practice I think we all have every opportunity to be in all day, every day. And yet,
mm. Well, let's say more about that. You have this idea of transcontextual relating and transcontextuality, semathesy. Is that how you say it?
yeah,
Let's talk about that a little bit.
okay, good. This is my favorite topic. So yes, there's the word transcontextual is a word that my father, Gregory Bateson, coined. And it's in Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And probably I read it, I don't know how many times before it hit me. And when it hit me, it was such a relief, because I was really struggling with the limitations of words like interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and even intersectional. These
Mm,
things did not have movement in them, where contexts are processes that are moving. And so what I was excited about was the this idea of looking at the way different contexts come together. So, um, well, one example that I have used in many times is the example of learning to play the violin. Okay, so there's lots of different ways in which this organism learns. Lots of different ways. And each one of these different ways is in a different kind of communication with my body, with my world, with the people around me, with culture, with language, etc. Um, And so if I'm learning to play the violin, there's one context that might be muscles, right? My muscles are learning. There's one context that's intellect. There's one context that is going to be the relationship with the teacher, relationship with culture, relationship with music. That might be emotional. Then there's the verbal descriptions and the process of putting words on this. Then there's the instrument itself, and that this is all happening over time. Um, and if I ask you, where's the learning? You're going to very rightly say, well, it's in the way these things are combining, right? The way these different kinds of cognition and learning are combining and informing each other. So some days my muscles are informing my intellect. Some days my intellect is informing my muscles. Some days I might have a particularly poignant emotional landscape that comes into new rhythms that I can make in my body, new sentiments that come through that I didn't have before. Some days there's a communication with my violin teacher, or and into what culture, what family, what history is this happening? So I that's one example, but you could also look at a biological example. You could look at a tree, okay, and you could ask, how is the tree learning to be in its world? And if you ask that question, you're going to actually find yourself perceiving the tree very differently than if you say, how do we fix this tree? So you might have a crooked tree. And the crooked tree is the same type of tree as other trees in the same forest, but those stand straight and tall. And so you might think this crooked tree is somehow needing to be adjusted or fixed or adapted, that action is needed. But which action? So if you ask, how is the tree learning to be in its world? Okay, you're going to look and see, where are the other trees casting shadows? Where are the people walking? What's in the nutrients of this soil? What's the slope like? Where's the water running? Where do the dogs pee? What time of year is it? And then you might start to see that the crookedness of the tree is an expression of its formation, in relation to the other organisms. This is an ecological process. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So, those moments when we reach for the biggest, juiciest apple on the shelf, that might not be the most ecological apple.
Mm.
That might be the apple that has been pushed to take up the nutrients for other organisms. It may be the little one that's actually the more ecological apple. So, in both of these cases, we're looking at different kinds of communication and relationships. Clearly, the tree is in different kinds of communication and relationships with the light than it is with the nutrients or the bacteria or the squirrels or the dogs or the humans or whatever, the other trees, the mycelia. So, for me, the different types of contexts are about different kinds of communication and relationship, different contexts of communication. So, I mean,
Mm.
the way I communicate with my kids is really different than the way I'm in communication with my microbiome. I think you'd agree with that. Probably for the best, too. So somathesy was a word that came in when I started to think about research, transcontextual research. How do we start to look at things and study things in a way that is not pulling those processes apart? Because the second you pull them apart, you've actually lost the very thing that's giving life to the situation, right? I'm going to study the muscles and how you play violin. I'm going to study the intellect. I'm going to study the emotion. Well, but what about how they're combining? Like, how do we do that study? And so I set up a research institute to do exactly this. And we set out to figure out how systems get unstuck. To make a long story very short, we realized that wasn't a good question, and the question actually became, how do systems learn? Because when they learn, the stuckness moves, and that learning is a transcontextual learning, which is not to say that all learning is good. Okay. You learn to lie, you learn to steal, you learn to hold back affection, you learn to be a crooked tree. But looking at that process of learning as being deeply transcontextual and ecological gives another whole realm of possibilities to what your response is going to be. What kind of action would you take if you start by asking not what's wrong with the child, but how is the child learning to be in their world? Not what's wrong with this mother, but how is this mother learning to be in her world? Right? Not what's wrong with the tree, but how is the tree learning to be in its world?
Mm,
So that piece of work needed a new word because actually the word system means arrangement. And what's lacking in that is time. There's no time. So you get a lot of systemic models and graphs that are freeze frames of some sort of systemic process. Fair enough. But I mean, we have to have some way of beginning to practice perceiving that they're changing. They're continuing to learn. And that the systems that we're looking at, whether it's family systems or biological systems, social systems, they are filled with living organisms that are changing.
mm,
And so if you operate from a frozen template, you're using the wrong map. That's actually going to produce all sorts of confusion and a reductionism. Again, a reductionism. So when you put time back into the question, what you see is that over time, all living systems are essentially always learning,
mm,
um, and responding to each other. They are adjusting to each other. They are coalescing. They're shaping each other. They're informing each other. And so that was a big opening. And actually, I'm still very excited about semathesy. I feel like it hasn't quite seen the sunshine yet, as a concept, but it's very, very useful
mm,
to really be thinking of any kind of life, my meadow, your meadow, my family, your family, as a grouping of learning organisms.
mm,
And then if the pathology or the struggle happens in learning, so does the healing. So, we get ourselves into these distortions and by learning, and we get ourselves through them and into new ways of being through learning. So this to me feels like a place um, where we don't get caught in definitions of pathology in the same way, uh,
mm,
because those can be very sticky and very difficult to get out of. So this notion of, what's wrong with the process, or what's wrong with the family, or wrong with the society, or wrong with that these questions, if we're not careful, they lead us to a concretization of of a description. And working with that is actually going to be considerably more difficult than starting with the idea that it's moving anyway, it's learning anyway. How's it learning? Let's shift the possibilities for how it's learning
mm.
by, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me, I forget who was saying this. I just want to acknowledge I wasn't the one who sort of thought of this, but the idea of like it's impossible to locate the edges of even your individual body for many reasons, but one of them is that our immune systems are co-evolving with our environments. And so like
Exactly.
our immune system would be radically different than somebody's from 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. And so those are literally systems learning from each other back and forth in this kind of like, not loop is the wrong word, of course, but this sort of like infinite exchange.
Yeah, I mean, this is symbiosis,
Mm,
right? And our immune systems are produced through symbionts that are in communication. There's essentially having a conversation and learning to be in conversation, in communication with each other.
mm,
So this is and if that's the case, then it's not as hard and it's not fixing a body that's ill. It's not the same thing as fixing a truck. Now, if you break a leg, okay. If there are some aspects that can be addressed with mechanistic logic that just can't argue with it. I just cannot. Um, However, there's quite a few processes that remain um, much more complex, and I think most people in the medical field are aware of this.
mm.
But it's kind of difficult because there's not the language for it, and there certainly isn't the kind of worlds of existing treatment that are premised on that.
Yeah, and I just think about all the things both in myself and others where you have a set of symptoms that don't fit any known category, but they're no less real. And that
Mhm,
brings me to some of your thinking around aphanipoesis and like versus insidious, like this
mhm.
idea that what's submerged is actually where the movement is, and by the time emergence is occurring, that's actually like many orders out rather than the sort of surprising feature. I'd love to sort of invite you to share a little bit about in this context.
Oh boy, your poor audience. They're getting sympathecy, transcontextual, and aphanipoesis all in the first 20 minutes. Um, so this was after 10 years of working with warm data, and which is this idea that information is actually produced in multiple contexts coming together. Um, I I was really getting pressed to describe what was happening and how it might be of benefit. I had a rough time with that because the language isn't in the culture for this. And I felt honestly, I just felt like, the tailor that was selling the emperor new clothes. And I was like, you see, there's all this really important stuff, it's just invisible. And it needs to be invisible. And then, I just like, how am I gonna deliver that? How am I gonna say what's happening? And then finally kind of recognizing that it needs to be like that. And that there was some moment, okay, where I realized I'm not going to apologize for this anymore. This thing that I'm seeing that's creating really significant and profound shifts in social groups is and must be something that remains in the unseen. Okay, so the habit of the culture is to pull things out, to name them, and there are times when you have to name things. Some things need to get named. And there are other ways in which naming things makes them concrete and pulls them out of that world of relational process in which there is movement. And so it can create a certainty and a frozenness. Um, so again, I made a word. Okay, so symathesy is sim, which means together, and mathesi, which means learning. And basically, symathesy means transcontextual mutual learning, which I think was you can probably feel was the precursor for where this other stuff was going. And then especially during the pandemic, there kept I kept wondering, I wonder what about these changes that we're living into right now is what's going to sink in and transform something that transforms something that transforms something that becomes a behavior that we become absolutely normal with in the future. And that wasn't the question that other people were asking. They were asking, what is emergent? And I realized, no, I actually want to know what's submerging. And that submergent question was coming through what I was doing with warm data. So it turns out that somehow organisms know how to evolve. They don't know how exactly they are going to evolve, very importantly, but they do know how to evolve. And that wild organisms have a lot more of that information than domestic ones. Okay? So, because organisms in the wild are in interdependent relationships with lots of other organisms that are learning and changing and shifting, they are sharing experience. There's information that's happening there, and that information isn't immediately useful. It's information that doesn't apply at the moment to whatever that organism's contextual continuing is. So it goes into a cache, if you will, a sort of secret unseen pocket, because the organism doesn't need it yet. But then later on, maybe the descendants of that organism find themselves in some other context in which that information is necessary, and whoop, there it is. They can draw from it. Where domesticated animals don't have that. So they can't find, they're missing, all this information for um, how to make the changes they need to make to continue to be alive. What is that? How does that apply to us? Especially as, in your podcast is called Urgent Futures. And that urgency often brings people to do very, very silly things. And the urgency can be dangerous. One of the things that urgency does is it fosters the habit of assigning definitions and meaning and strategy way before the perception has taken place that is actually tending to the multiple processes in play. Um, so we get this, the story of the guy who's looking for his keys under the lamp. And someone comes up and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking for my keys." He says, "Is this where you dropped them?" He says, "No, I dropped them in the forest over there." "Why are you looking under the lamp?" "Because this is where I can see," he says. And so there's a good deal of that going on. There's a good deal of urgent response to those things that are immediately perceivable in the way that you and I have been trained to perceive. Okay, we were trained through school, through language, through media, through various forms of um, metaphors, assumptions, art, all kinds of things, technology. So, the trickery of aphanipoesis. Aphani means unseen, and poesis means becoming. And the thing came into view that so many of the issues that we are actually trying to face are actually insidious. They're insidious. You can't just tell people not to be racist or to love you or to respect you. You can't just tell people they have to get along and they should live ecologically and they should stop wasting and stop smoking. Like, look at how many times you try to just tell people stop smoking, stop drinking. Stop hurting each other. Stop lying. And nothing happens. They might even agree to it. Oh yeah, I'll quit. Oh yeah, I will. I'm going to be better. But because it is an insidious issue, it's not actually graspable in the place where that message is living. Um, where is it? Where do those things live? Where do they live? Well, they live in some kind of slow coalescence of experiences that gradually produce a kind of assumption or logic or entangled notion of what it is to be alive that includes something that is insidious:
Mm,
misogyny, racism, corruption, greed, um, selfishness, whatever. So, so this coalescing of processes is really what I'm interested in. And how might we nourish that coalescence in a way that allows deep shifts to take place?
mm,
But that's not in the scene zone. You don't know what those coalescing experiences are in your life that you draw from in their already stewed, brewed soup, right? You just draw from them. You no longer can remember what happened on that bus or that night or who hurt you in that way, or you're not gathering the details. There's just a general coalescence and it's very unseen.
mm,
So tending to that zone, what I have come to call the Afani poetic realm, um, is very exciting, and it requires a lot of integrity. Because let's go back to the wild animals, okay? Because the wild animals have a multitude of relationships and contexts that they are bringing in unseen information into their little secret pocket for later, right? Their Afani poetic pocket. Um, but they don't know it's there. But it's multitudes. It's an ecology of relationships. I would say, sadly, that the very thing that I'm talking about with Afani poesis is something that people who are professionals in propaganda or advertising know a great deal about manipulating this exact thing where you don't know what you're taking in, but it's working through you and into you. And it's not an ecology and it's not in a multiplicity of alive relationships. It's located in a very narrow set of relational possibilities. And so that's dangerous. Um, So with the warm data, that's exactly what we're doing is we're offering lots and lots of relational possibilities to nourish that Afani poetic realm. And then guess what? I do not get to say what will happen. Right? If I'm honest, if I'm true at all to what I say I want to do in this world, I do not have the right to say how you should learn to live, to feel, to think, to remember your life, to see other people. It is not mine to do that with. And what I have found is that that piece is difficult for folks. Yeah, we want to use this Afani poetic work toward this outcome. No, you don't get to do that. People learn and they find coalescence. Things happen in ways that they weren't expecting, in ways that doesn't maybe look like what you thought you were looking for. So you have a whole group of people and you're going to try to teach them to be, you know, nonviolent ecologists. And instead, some of them, you know, suddenly quit smoking, or they go home and they're with their families in a new way, or they start to take care of their body in a new way, or they take an interest in poetry or permaculture. And it might look nothing like what you thought was the thing, but that is systemic work. You don't get to say what the outcome is. Where's the edge of the system? So you do a thing and then something happens and then more things happen and then more things happen. And that leads to more things. And when do you get to say in any kind of systemic work, well, we did the thing and here this was the outcome? No. If it's real systemic work, you will never know because it's infinite. It's moving in time. And so that linearity of a deliverable isn't, it's just not on the table.
Mhm.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and in the book, you identify a number of words, and words that, even for somebody who, my passion is words and language, um, didn't know the particular etymologies, like thinking about energy and impact, as being from physics and the way that physics has been instrumentalized, in techno-industrial society. And then of course deliverable and the idea and function, like, this way of relating that's very closed loop. um it brings me to a sort of a question I was very excited to kind of get into with you here, because I mean, you referenced the name of this show, and it also kind of um hyperlinks to Bayo Kamalafe's thinking, particularly, the times are urgent, we must slow down. One thing that I struggle with is I really resonate with everything that I hear from you on podcasts and that I read in combining, um, and yet I do feel this lurking sense that we do somehow have to move fast. That the emergencies are they are blaring. I should clarify with the show. I take a very broad view with urgency and urgent. Which is more to describe, like, there can be urgent comedy, urgent play. It's not exclusively the kind of negative dimension of urgency. But still, kind of coming back to the question, like, how are you balancing? Because you clearly care very much. You write about the poly crisis and speak about the poly crisis, not infrequently. And when you observe the data that relates to the poly crisis, it is alarming.
Mhm.
And so how do you balance both internally, like in yourself, but then also in how you're bringing yourself to warm data labs?
Yes.
These things stand quite in paradox with each other.
They do and they don't. Um, I think probably the biggest danger, that there's two big dangers that I see right now. There's many, but let's take the top two. One is that we're going to try to make solutions that in fact perpetuate the problems because
Mm,
the thinking hasn't changed. The response is going to be destructive. It's not going to do what we thought it would because we aren't in fact fixing a pickup truck. What we're trying to do is move in, we're trying to work with that tree. We're living in a crooked tree. And so um, the time that it takes to perceive that tree and respond in new ways, you see, this is exactly where I was going in the beginning. If you take that time on the front end, you're not dealing with so much on the other end. But it's so annoying to not be able to use the mechanistic principles that we have been trained in, to apply them and activate and use our agency and do the thing. But when we do the thing, it gets worse. And suddenly we're creating revolutions, which brings me to the second piece, which is the polarity. So a lot of the ways in which people have tried to address polycrisis processes has actually just served to enhance the polarization between different kinds of demographics, between nations, between cultures, between peoples, between political points of view, between religions, between, right? So and seriously, whatever it is that needs to get faced, some people somewhere will figure out how, unless they hate each other. But if we hate each other, we've got no choice, no chance of figuring out what how to respond. So those two things are living very close to each other, and so I mean I've been around this for a long time, and when I was a very small child at dinner tables 55 years ago, people were having this exact conversation. It's urgent, and so the the climate conferences and the graphs and the attempts to strategize this have frankly all gone wrong over and over and over again. And even when sometimes it looks like, oh, this is really great, we're really making headway, there's other contexts into which, that's actually generating a polarity, or it's, sucking from some other direction, or it's creating. So I guess I'm here to support everybody who wants to try to do it with strategic process, and to bring whatever I can to their projects and their process. And also, I'm probably going to be frustrating in that room, because I'm going to see where the abstractions are mismatched, and where the transcontextual processes are all confounded, um, which isn't generally convenient. And so I don't know what to say. Yes, it's urgent, and the expression that bio uses, that I think it comes from lots of different places in the world, and it's like that for a reason. And when you move too fast, you can't perceive things.
Mm,
It's another form of reductionism is speed.
mm,
So if you think about what you can perceive, even if you just very slowly touch your nose, it's really differently than if you just there's just you might perceive, oh, my arm is moving, yes, my elbow is moving, oh, I'm moving in this direction, my finger, there's all kinds of perception that you could perceive just touching the end of your nose. um but if you just do like that and continue, like, you did not participate in the perception of all of these quite incredible um, physiological processes that it takes to go like that. So I would say that it matters, and practice. So I think maybe part of the issue is that because there's not a lot of practice in this type of perception, and really, I mean, we need dojos for this. We need a space where we are actually really practicing together. And the more you practice, the more readily you will perceive it. And then maybe it's not quite as slow,
mm.
especially if we do it together.
Yeah, could you share a little bit about how, um, like, I recognize there's a certain extent to which, like, you can't describe what's happening in a warm data lab
Mm.
because it's distinct unto itself.
Yeah.
Um, but what are you and other folks who are then, facilitating these labs inviting in? Like, is there a taste you can give or a glimpse you can give?
Okay.
Um,
I'll
you
try.
know
But if this doesn't make any sense to anybody, I understand. So in a warm data lab, there's a question. And the question always is gonna it's in particular relationship to the contexts that are given to the little groups of people. So that's a whole piece on levels of abstraction and perception of abstraction. So that's you don't just choose any question and any contexts. So you have a question. Let's say the question is, what is home in a changing world? That's a very complex question. What is home? And then you have all these contexts. And they look like our institutions because that's where we really need to work right now is in untangling from that. So you could have economy, family, culture, education, politics, technology, media, science, art, just a lot of contexts. And in each group, you have a few people, and they just start having a conversation. What is home in a changing world? Okay. And what is home in a changing world keeps you from just answering with certainty because in a changing world, home is changing. So it keeps it alive. And then as people start to do that, what's home in a changing world through the context of family? And you're there for a while and you're hearing different voices. And at first, people try to be clever. At first, they think, oh, well, this is a conversation and I need to produce something that's of interest because I don't want us to all be wasting our time here. Actually, it doesn't really matter what you say. Nobody is the clever one in a warm data lab. No one cares. What is actually significant is when people drop into personal story. When they drop into personal story, then something starts to awaken. But people like to download their knowledge and their expertise, and that's fine too. So after a while, you move. You as an individual go to a different context. I'm going to go over here to economy because what we're really talking about is money. So, what's home in a changing world through the context of economy? And you start to play with that idea. And someone tells a story and it makes you think of some things. And then you might tell a story. And after a while, you go to another context. And maybe you go to, I don't know, education. And then you're talking about what is home in a changing world through the context of education. And those other two conversations you had with family and economy did not just fall out of you. They're really right there with you. So, unlike a lot of conversations, the transcontextual space provides a space where there is so much contextual possibility that you don't get really caught in the polarities. Okay, turns out in order to have a flaming polarity, you need to remove context. Um, so you're not going to get, big, juicy, conflicting conversations in a warm data lab, which is fine. Actually, you can have those in a lot of other places. Don't you worry. Um, so, so you move through a few contexts. What's happening? On the one hand, you're just talking to people and you're actually hearing their stories and you're telling stories and it's interesting. On the other hand, you are perceiving the different possibilities of communication and perception from multiple people at one context. And every time they say something, or sometimes when they don't say something, it's going to light up an impression for you somewhere. Oh, that reminds me of, I wonder if I should tell the story of, I haven't thought about that in a while. So there's this world of unspoken impressions and impressions that lead to impressions that might, light up other impressions. That's what I'm interested in. Okay, so the talking circles are there to provide lots of overlapping, intertwining voices, perceptions, tonalities, stories with rich details. So it's there to like stir up your details. Find all those little impressions. And you probably aren't even going to be noticing so much about those things that are coming up for you. Fair enough. I don't want you to pull them into the spotlight and try to find them like keys. Leave them there. Let them coalesce. Let them find each other. Let these memories and these impressions start to reweave themselves into new ways of being in that aphonic poetic space. So you can't see it. You can record a warm data lab. You can write down things on whatever, manner of documentation you feel you need to, but nothing that's actually of interest is going to be on there. And yet, because of that, and because it is such a rich space for multiple contexts, multiple people, overlapping multiple things, there is something that starts to shift. And I mean, sometimes people get really stuck, but for the most part, it happens pretty fast. And after many years of trying to teach complexity, I finally gave up. Um, and but the lab is a way that then people perceive their own memories in complexity. They perceive other people as being complex. Now, for me, that's pretty much the highest level of respect and love that you can offer, is to actually give somebody room to be in their learning, moving complexity with you.
Mm,
So, um, if I'm going to say what happens in a warm data lab, I would say uh, it's nothing changes because everything is changing.
mm,
So you're not going to get a single outcome, but you will get a new basis from which response to all manner of circumstances in people's lives is shifted. And that doesn't happen in the lab.
mm,
You don't know that because it's when they go out. It's their next encounter or their next meeting or their next thing they go do that they start to perceive really differently. And then they can communicate really differently because they're perceiving something differently. And that communication then elicits a different response, right? And away we go into the edgeless systemic infinity. And that's good enough for me. I feel like that's a day's work done.
mm. Oh, that's amazing. I can't wait to do one.
Yeah, I know. You should come do one.
I fully intend to.
Good.
Um, this feels like a good moment to maybe call in some of the poetry from the book.
Oh, good.
Um, I
Yeah.
have I have, one that I'd like to call in, but before that, I'd like to sort of invite you to do what you like to do, which is to sort of flip through the book and find a spot that calls to you.
Hmm. Let's see what we've got. Well, there's essays in here that I would love to read to you, but I don't think we've got the time.
And folks should go get the book.
But the poetry is easier to share because, frankly, it's shorter. Um,
You also have sort of vignette, or you have vignettes as well, but you have sort of poetic essays, which I was
yeah,
very intrigued by.
yeah, little ones. Oh, how about this? This is not a poem, but I just flipped to it. It's called Minutia of the Day.
Mm.
And it's a little prose piece, like you were saying, one of these little vignettes. We could even convince ourselves that it's not within quote unquote human nature or the capacities of human cognition to be able to perceive ecological processes. They are too multiple, always changing, too entangled. I'm not so certain about this. Ancient cultures and indigenous peoples have participated in ecological processes without destroying them for thousands of years. They knew. They did not use the vocabulary of complexity theory established in universities in the 1950s, but they knew. I work with small children who grasp these concepts, as well as people all over the world who have never set foot inside a complexity theory class. Life is already doing this. Being able to talk about complexity and ecology is not the same thing as being, living with a perception that's within the ecologies and the complexities of life. Abouting is not the same. And anyway, we're only partially human. Most of our cells belong to the trillions of organisms that live on and in us. Perhaps they are not yet. Perhaps they are as yet untamed by the industrial dream. Perhaps we have sensitivities that are still within the membership of ecological process. It is not a professional tool. It's a way of life that's encompassing and saturates through every minutia of the day. Getting complexity begins at home in the communication and perception within our most intimate relationships. This is vital. That seems to fit in for today, right?
Perfectly, perfectly,
Yeah,
I love it.
yeah.
And I love that it was one of the, poetic essays, 'cause I was there were a few of those where I thought, "Wow, this is a cool hybridization, and it makes total sense."
Mm,
But it sort of it kind of, like, form and functioned me, where it was kind of, like, doing what the book was, advocating for. The other poem that I was hoping you would read, although I foolishly didn't write down the page number, is
that's a
Urgent Mud.
okay, urgent mud. Yeah, I love urgent mud. Right, of course you want urgent mud. I get it. We're doing urgent stuff. Okay, that's page 142. I love this piece. 142. It's a little longer than the prose piece, having said that the poems were shorter. No, you always have to do that. All right, urgent mud. Inside, getting juicier. The rub of so many paradoxes has worn down the compartment walls of my being. Wherever me is, and however many blurred variables that might include bacteria, ancestors, an idea, a dance, melting forms, grinding down stones. The grit of disintegrating the boxes gradually got soggy. Wetness and the goo of tears and the gravy of life's weird turns. The mud has become a puddle of possibility, opaque, formless, and in its own time. The mud is just sitting there, not doing anything I can see, but it's doing something. It is making. How long will it take to become something? No idea. How will it begin to quicken and connect? No idea. How will it shape? What will it be? No idea. Fusings, musings, combining are in motion. In a world of rapid change, fluctuating environments require the ability to respond to unrecognizable circumstances. Now, let it be mud. There is nothing that will come otherwise. This is urgent mud. It ferments, it starts something, a small unseen stickiness, then more. Then there is a happening outside. I'm still pinched by the collective exoskeleton of ideas on how to fix the nice muck. Name it, plan it, shape it, the wrongness of it, the uselessness of it, the pointlessness of it, the purposelessness of it. Oh, yes, it must be thus, precisely unseeable from here. Later, maybe there will be a moment to say, ah, it was there all along. Will saying this negate the worlds of creative work in the precious dark mud it took to allow new forms through? Will we forget that it took being lost?
Thank you so much. Both extremely beautiful pieces.
Hmm. I love that you requested Urgent Mud. It's been a
I
while.
mean, irrespective of the title, I actually wanted you to read it. It just happened, like all the pieces sort of came together. But I just it they're all of a piece inevitably. But just thinking about muds, and I mean, you referenced compost and crooked trees and the sort of interconnection of all of it. Or sorry, not the interconnection, the interrelatedness, interdependence. Um, you said something in the recent roundtable on the Great Simplification that I want to take this moment to kind of like push further into.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just gonna sort of quote you here. You said that you wanted to gather the four of you together to open the beginnings of this place of inviting each other to go beyond our usual scripts, our usual positionings, our usual habits, and to not know exactly what we're going to say, to be at a loss for words. There's an ellipsis. When I get quiet and I find myself groping around inside to look for the thing that I'm trying to say and I don't have any words for it, then I know, okay, this is worth my time. Let's play with this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I thought that was a really profound invitation, particularly given um, the four of you who are such eloquent public speakers and public figures. And there's a yeah, something on the edge, something dangerous to that. And so as a starting point, I wanted to ask, was there something that had prompted you, or a series of experiences that had prompted you to have that desire?
Mm-hmm.
And then the follow-up part, this can all be one mush of a question, is have you found particular moments recently that afforded you this opportunity to kind of break from your scripts or your usual habits?
So this is something that speakers and audiences have to do together, and and I would say it's urgent, because as long as we're having the same conversation and we're staying on the same scripts, we're just going round and round on this hamster wheel. So I don't want to be a hamster on a wheel. I want to be in the meadow. And in order to do that, there is the risk of being perceived as somebody who is not an expert, who doesn't know their stuff, who is not coming out boom, boom, boom with big words that swish together and are very impressive. Um, I mean, I could do that. We could do that. But actually, I think there's some dishonesty in it, in so much as we are also trying to figure out how to get through the day, trying to figure out how to heal the wounds with our parents and be in our communities and figure out how to carry the heavy complicity of being part of the exploitation, the destruction that this era is 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 is. So I mean, I think if you're so full of pithy answers and quick responses that you're able to just nip, 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 nip all those questions in the bud, that maybe there's a need to actually um, get lost. Look for a word. Forget what you're talking about. Find yourself on some detour of a story somewhere. Loosen the pattern, because if we're caught in the pattern, we're not getting anywhere. We're just rehearsing a script. And that's really, there's a kind of rote learning that happens in rehearsing a script, but the kind of learning that's needed is the kind of experimenting together and and finding together, um, that that requires being lost together. So And you asked if anything prompted it, and the answer to that is yes. And it's happened over the last 10 years or so, that certainly with social media, whenever there's a recording, you get these comments. I really like this. I don't like that. She said like this. He didn't do that. He missed this concept. And it's always, I like you or I don't like you. Or this was okay, but they forgot this. And what is always missing is that what I'm saying is not just me saying it, right? It's something that you are bringing out in me. And what is happening here is not me just downloading. What's happening is that there is our communication is, you're changing me and I'm changing you. And what's interesting here is that, right? If and that is something that shows we're alive, that we are learning, that we can respond, that we are capable of thinking and speaking and being together in ways that we don't even know yet. So for me, that's much more interesting than what did she say or what did she not say, or and particularly, I guess, when Daniel and I do things together, our style is so different, but our content is not.
Mm,
And we were really getting these polarized comment threads that were just ugly.
mm,
And it was so sad because we have a lot of love for each other. And I love doing things with Daniel because he brings something else out in me and I can bring something else out in him, and we hold, it's like a salad, right? You want to have that crispy roasted pecan alongside that juicy sweet tomato, right? That's what gives it the fullness of life, and the way, again, the way that your impressions are forming when one person speaks is different than how they form when another person speaks. So it's opening up new possibilities for connections and putting together thoughts that you hadn't done before. That's so much more interesting than I really like him, I don't like her, I really like her, I don't like him, which is frankly boring. So, and this is something that I'm seeing everywhere. And so, I mean, my heart is really there, that attention to the ecology of communication is so much more important than the what someone says. What the meta communication, the possibilities of what they could communicate, what tone, what texture, what vibe, if you will, they're invited into that communication with. I mean, if I'm in a certain kind of circumstance, I can speak in really scientific language. I try not to do that because when I do that, it becomes a reductionism of that ecology of communication, which for me is the fertile soil of possibility. But it's dangerous when an audience is expecting a particular reductionist version, a particular rehearsed script,
mm,
as a signal of credibility or expertise or certainty of definition. And we're losing a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of great folks out there getting interviewed and being in conversations, and the ecology of what is possible is lost because the culture wants to glom on to, you know, their scripts. Play your hit song, Dear
free
Daniel.
bird. Yeah,
Tell us about the meta crisis.
yeah.
Dear Nora, tell us what warm data is, and we can do that all day long. That's the problem. So this is why I feel it really requires something from audiences too, who are requesting an ecology, not to
Mm,
take sides, but to
mm,
feel the tensions, the paradoxes, and what comes alive in you in new ways. I don't know.
mm.
We need it so badly. The invention of the comment thread has created this monster
Yeah.
of I agree, I disagree. Yes, no, yes, no. Why'd you say this? Well, they didn't say that. It's just, ugh, I wish we could just stuff that thing back under the rock it came from.
It's funny you're saying this now because I'm just encountering this because I just released an episode I did with Bill Rees, you know, famously a firebrand. And, he was critiquing the, what he calls so-called renewable energy sources as ultimately just perpetuating, fossil fuel
Yeah.
capitalism. And he's very clear that, this is not, it's very clear that he's not saying that like we should be using fossil fuels. Um, but all these all these comments come that are, the kind of like incredulous, like, oh yeah, but we should keep using fossil fuels and whatever. And I just sort of like, I was a journalist for many years, and so those don't compare to the death threats. But what I really feel personally when I see those is I reflect on my own behavior when I'm watching like a vertical video on Instagram Reels or TikTok or something like that. And I want that deeper context, and my, scattered attention, the medium is the message aspect of like being on vertical video kind of blitzes your attention, and you go to the comment section, and then there's all these people that are saying funny things, mean things, like the full range of stuff. But what really comes through is that it's like they're really truly not seeing real people on the other side of that video. It's like it is like a shared abstract, like pure abstract space where no real person's gonna see this or feel this.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, like I said, it's a practice, and I think we have to do it together. And so I'm really wanting to invite other speakers and audiences to start to play with this structure, because there is no time to stay in the same conversations.
Mm,
And so
duly noted.
how to open that up. And I mean, I'm not exactly innocent of it myself. So I'm not saying that I am. I'm just saying we need to play with this together. And
Yeah.
and playing in urgent times is urgent. Like you said, there's urgent play needed. And I was recently at a session that Bio held in Great Barrington, and he did a thing that I really loved, which was he had all of these invited guests on stage, and there were nine of us. Well, there were eight including him, so there was three on each sofa. And we were asked a question about, actually it was about failure. And then everybody was kind of popping in and out. But we had no prep. We didn't know what we were talking about till we got on stage. So zero prep, no PowerPoints, no, like, you have to just draw from
Mm,
your life's work, your life's being, your life's experience. And but still, it's not so hard to get on one of one's own little diatribes of this or that. And so Bio hacked it by having it be it was called a carnival, and so there were people in costumes kind of moving around the stage, and that was great
mm,
because there was this, like, just teasing into, don't take yourself so seriously, and there was interruption, and there was humor in moments that were very dire. And
mm.
I loved that because it just keeps us a little bit shaken, so that you don't. I mean, people who speak a lot have things they say a lot, and you can just push the button and out they come. So it's good to shake it up.
I love that, and I definitely want to put some thought into how I can bring that into this podcast. Um, yeah, so thank you for sharing more on that.
I love when I watch people think.
Mm,
When they don't hop out with an answer in 1 second, but they think about it, and they come to a point where, what would be the word that would be the right word here? And then I know that it matters to them. And so I find that really engaging. Um, and it for me, it gives me a sense that I want to hear what they're saying, what they're thinking,
Mm.
which is, I mean, is so not what we see on the news or in any other place where you have to spit out that sound bite in 15 seconds and you need to spit out 12 more in the next minute. And
Totally.
there's no time to think. There's no time to consider, to grok, to let something go into you and to ruminate on it, to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think about kind of coming back to an earlier part of the conversation when somebody says something you disagree with. I mean, there's bad faith people out there, or people acting in bad faith, I should say. So I'm not necessarily including that in this, but people who you can tell are operating in good faith, saying something you disagree with is a great favor to you
Mhm.
because of that thing of like it lands inside you and you have to really kind of play with it with your fingers. And you don't have that easy kind of like nod along with the person you totally agree with feeling.
Mhm. Yeah. There's just been an awful lot said. Maybe we can say some new things.
Boom. I have so much more that I want to talk to you about. Hopefully, I can have you back sometime in the future, but I also want to be mindful of time. And I have three recurring questions that I like to close each episode with. And obviously, you've said things that might already feed into those. Feel free to call those back in. Um, the first one is, what's one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Mm. The intimacy of their day-to-day relationships. I think if there's one thing that I've really become acutely aware of in working with complex systems and trying to move these big complex systems is that the shift that is made at home in how you say good morning to your partner, how you are with your kids, how you pay attention to not repeating those things that maybe your parents or ancestors um, normalized in your life. So, watching out in your very intimate, close relationships for the the ghosts of industrialism and modernity that are so destructive. Um, and it's one thing to be out on the in the big world and casting solutions in big places, but that needs to be bone deep. And the urgency, again, to rush out and change the big world is, I think, a disruption of the actual process which it takes place in in recognizing how interrelational process, how different kinds of communication, different tones, different timings, different pacings actually make it possible for relationships to shift at home
Mm,
in your most immediate world
mm,
with your parents, even if they're dead and gone. There is a need to really, I guess that's what I would say. Don't overlook the importance of every day's opportunities to pay attention to interdependent processes that you live in that matter to you
mm.
before we go stamping solutions all over billboards.
One follow-up question to that, is you talked about, growing up, being in Esalen and seeing this culture of, like, individual betterment. How are you balancing in your mind the, sense that it's important to really focus on, the ecologies of your family and the ecologies of your individual world, but then also not falling into the trap of, like, mechanistic self-improvement, I will be better. Like, do you have any words on that?
I've got words. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're talking about is really how do you be in relationship with the people close to you in a way that allows for mutual learning. And for me, that starts with this question of who can I be when I'm with you? And if I start to see myself hopping out as, you know, all manner of somebody's I might not want to actually be, then that's something for me to really look at. How can and who can you be when you're with me? So if I'm seeing a bunch of behavior that I think, that's not good, then I am also needing to really look at how I'm in that relationship. What what are the tonalities? What are the atmospheres, the meta messages in that relationship? This is ecology. This is not personal betterment. I mean, you might end up being a nicer human, but that's not my department. I'm much more interested in how it's possible for us to be together,
Mm,
and that is a training. It's an everyday practice of recognizing if you've got four people in a room, what are the ways in which your relationship with your spouse becomes reflected in the relationships between the kids, or between the kids and the grandparents, or between the grandparents and the neighbors, or that, right? So, this thing is not contained to your kitchen table. It reaches back hundreds of years and it reaches forward. So if we want to tend. And what can you do? How do you I think one thing that I would say is, in my life I've learned never to underestimate the potency of actually smiling at someone you love when they enter the room,
mm,
and just letting them know, I am glad to see you. I'm glad I'm sharing my life with you. And what changes from there, right? Or being in a
mm,
conversation with your kids in which you say, wow, I am so glad you brought that up. I totally didn't see that. And they get to see you learn. Or if you're with your partner and your partner says something that you hadn't considered and you really want to be right, but actually there's something interesting there. And
mm,
your kids are watching. Let your kids see you learn together,
mm,
right? So these are ways in which we can begin to um, make the possibility realm open of how we can be together in different ways. It's not about me being a better person. It's about what's happening in this meadow that is my family.
mm. I love that. Um, On to the next question. What is the what what is the or what is a resource that you use to make better sense of reality, or that you recommend for others?
So many things. I love to cook. So there's a lot in cooking, right? There's the relationship with the seasons, the relationship with nutrition, the relationship with just the art form, the love, the the creativity of how just being in the kitchen, fire, temperature, spices. Um, so I think that there's another thing, right? A few times a day, you got to eat something. And in what are you eating? How are you tending it? What does it look like, feel like, taste like? How is it given? What is it? What is the offering? That every possible eating moment is actually, no matter what you've got on hand. I mean, sometimes if it's just a little plain rice with something over it, or, it doesn't have to be fancy, but it matters. Food is communication. So that's one thing. Um, but also art, poetry, being with other species, any kind of communication with um, nonverbal organisms. So by that I mean organisms that won't speak in sentences back to you. Babies, dogs, cats, trees. Um, that's important. We need to practice this, especially in the AI era.
Mm.
Especially now, time spent in nonverbal communication is so important.
Can I ask why specifically in the AI era? I feel like there's more to that.
Have you played with it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, what it's doing is it's basically taking so much language and just flattening it. So, it's a really good way to see what kind of cliches we're living in.
Mm.
I mean, if you ask the AI, what will Nora say on urgent futures? It will tell you. And, what I'm really embarrassed about is that some of the language that I have actually used will be in there. And then I'll never want to use that language ever again because somehow it got cardboarded. It just turns to paste when AI gets a hold of it because it doesn't have any experience. So what is those ways in which we can transmit and communicate, receive experiential communication that is not located in vocabularies that can be ironed flat and fed back to us? That is really important because you could read those words and you could think that's what she said, but I'm telling you, that is not what I said
Mm.
because everything it repeated without coming from my bones and my breath and my blood and the hard work.
And the context of whatever venue or conversation.
Right? So, practice again, practice with nonverbal communication is necessary right now.
Mm. I love that. I love that too. And the final question, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
I grew up in the weirdest of circumstances, but because they were my circumstances, they weren't so weird. You know, when people say, "So, how did you grow up?" and you're like, "Well, I kind of grew up in my with my family in my house." But in this case, I was in the 70s in the California hotbed of um, everything from the really brilliant things that got loose in that renaissance of ideas um, and also just the disgusting greed and narcissism of the self-help movement. Um, and in and out of that were all manner of gurus and spiritual practices and all sorts of stuff. So imagine my surprise when, after my dad died, I got sent to a boarding school in Massachusetts. And I arrived in my dorm in my boarding school, and I realized I knew nothing of the culture that was my generation. That was a shocker. And I remember, Esalen, everybody was had their clothes off, and it was like, so I was in my dorm room and I needed to go to the shower, and I just put a towel on and went to the shower, and I took my towel off, and then everyone was like, "No, I was naked in the shower." Like, of course I was naked in the shower. Like, do you shower with your clothes on? What are you talking about? But I had, botched some subtle cultural protocol because I just had no concept of what how people were perceiving me. That was shocking and very painful. I
Mm.
think that's always a painful thing when you find yourself in a situation where there's another set of codes, and a whole different vocabulary of what is acceptable ways of being, and you don't know what they are. And so you blow it, or you don't come up with what they're waiting for. You don't show the flag they're looking for, and so you get shut down. It's painful.
Mm,
But I think those moments are also really good practice for being careful what particular set of codes we are each holding up when we're reading somebody,
mm,
and recognizing there's a lot of different ways to be in this world, and we can get really confused. So that disorientation is painful, but it's very educational.
mm. Yeah, you have this amazing piece on attraction and consent in the book, but that was also in the Journal of Design and Science, which I that detail floored me as well. We won't get into it now, but calling out that um, viewers and listeners should absolutely read the whole book, but that essay in particular related to the last subject.
Mm.
Um,
The I
Nora,
want me to want you piece. Maybe I'll read the first paragraph of it.
yeah, please.
I want you to want me to want you. I enter this conversation with the voices of generations that have come before and generations yet to come. They're screaming through the keyhole of this potentially transformational moment in history. Some tell stories of epic, passionate encounters, both found and unfound. Some have rage written in scar tissue. Many agonize in regret for brutally taking that which was not offered. Some meant well but failed. Not everyone meant well. Pain makes more pain, which makes numbness that makes more pain. Unspoken assumptions about perceived dominance in terms of gender, status, and appeal inform affections. These presuppositions are marinated into every interaction, sometimes as a rebellion against the past, other times in conformity. The hints and signals of old patterns can be blatant and easily recognizable, or they can be subtle, making it difficult to find a way out of the deep scripts of our past generations. Calling out these obsolete patterns is helpful, but it's unwise to assume that it will banish the patterns so easily. More likely, they will morph and twist into new frames. In the arc of the story of women, bras are an example. Women burned their bras in the 60s as a statement of emancipation, but now bras have become a symbol of confident sexuality in super sexy lingerie. My daughter asked, "Why burn bras? They're so pretty." What can I say? I'll leave it there. It's a long essay, but it explores many things.
Yes, many extremely important things. Yeah, I was blown away by the whole book. That essay among them.
Mm.
So yeah, on that note, I want to tell everybody go get this book. And Nora, invite you to share. Is there any other information or news or anything coming up that you'd like to share?
For yeah, let's see, news. Warm data courses run a week long. That's a deep intensive. You should definitely come to one.
I'm going to.
Ah, and I have a big one in the Bay Area in California, but that one's full. But there's one coming up in Amsterdam in February, an in-person one, and you can check the Warm Data website, and you'll find the information there. I don't know if we've posted about the Amsterdam one yet, but we will. There's other online versions of it as well. So that's happening. I'm working on a brand new piece that I'm excited about, and I'm playing around with some new language right now that I'm excited about around covering for each other.
Mm,
Noticing that the tropes of collaboration and sharing, caring are getting um, they're getting metabolized into the existing system,
mm,
and they weren't really the right metaphors anyway. But looking at this idea of covering for each other in so much as a meadow has lots of different kinds of pollinators. There's not just bees, there's butterflies and birds and spiders and moths and all kinds of different flies and pollinators that are there when there's a drought, when there's a flood, when one of the other species can't show up, the other ones are making sure the pollination happens. Um, that this is how ecologies do redundancy, right? So there's lots of different kinds of blossoms, lots of different kinds of pollinators, and they're all a little different. And what they can do is a little different. And what they can do this year is a little different than what they'll do next year. But just recognizing this form of ecological redundancy, right? So the days of you do your thing, I'll do my thing, and we will create a functional system. That metaphor is mechanistic. How do we bring ecology into that? And that means that, I want you to be able to cover for me if I can't do something. And I'm sure that you have people in your life right now that are faltering. This is the era we live in. How do we cover for them? I don't know how to do what they do, but I'm going to try to cover for them. Be redundant and know that it's a way of saying I've got your back, but in a more ecological way. I don't know what I'll need to do, but I'll do something and I'll learn something about myself in the process. So that piece I would just want to add this let's cover for each other. My success is not mine. It's only possible if it is there in the relationship. So what do I need to do to keep this meadow? And recognize that the meadow of the existing systems is not the meadow I'm talking about. I'm talking about the living world. Yeah.
right. You're not talking about the monocrop rows of corn
No,
and soy.
I'm not see, that's redundancy in another mindset,
Mm,
right? Where you have a monocropping or a producing of the same, where the different kind of ecology that redundancy is that the butterflies do different things than the bees do, and they move in different ways and they're different patterns and they communicate. It's a whole different ecology of communication. So I just wanted to share that with you because I'm excited about it, and I haven't really written it up totally yet, but I'm getting ready to. So
I love the sound of it. It reminds me of your what you kind of called in with the apple. How like,
mhm.
the tree will produce smaller or bigger apples depending on what's happening more broadly.
Yeah,
Uh,
respond to the context, right?
mm.
It might not be your turn to do the dishes, but if everybody else is tired, do them.
And that is a perfect note to end things on. Nora, this has been a real joy, and I'm so grateful that you came on the show.
Thank you so much. It was a real joy for me too.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.